All right, the hole in quantum mechanics and the CTMU. So as the title of this video suggests, we're going to talk about the hole in quantum mechanics and then follow up with a brief description of Chris Langen's cognitive theoretic model of the universe, or CTMU. Now, by the hole in quantum mechanics, I mean the measurement problem. Quantum mechanics will tell you, probabilistically at least, what will happen when you measure a quantum system. What it doesn't tell you is what actually constitutes a measurement. To explain this further, we'll take a closer look at the famous double slit experiment, which Feynman said contained all the mystery of quantum mechanics. So the double slit experiment is where you fire a bunch of photons at a detector screen, but in their way is a plate with a couple slits in it. Not all the photons make it through, but each photon that makes it through sets off a single point on that screen like it's a particle. However, if you keep track of the pattern of points the detector screen picks up, eventually you'll find yourself with a pristine interference pattern, mathematically correspondent with the photons emerging from the slits as a pair of waves that interfere with each other. This happens even if you shoot the photons one at a time. However, if you try to see what happens at the point of the slits, specifically which slit a photon goes through, the photons that make it through appear to not have acted like waves at all, and you just get two bands on the screen corresponding to the two slits. And so notably, detectors always pick up single particles. And yet if we detect those particles after some point where if they were waves they'd have interfered with each other, we always detect the particles in a pattern that indicates that wave interference is exactly what happened. And so that's why quantum mechanics is based on the idea that unmeasured quantum systems behave like waves, whereas once measured they behave like particles or collapse. Okay, so far so good. I think most people have heard that before, and it's usually presented like it's supposed to be shocking, but I think any reasonable person wonders, okay, but maybe these waves are just fragile, and if you have to touch them to detect them, maybe they're just like balloons that pop. Now, even here, it's not exactly that simple because, for example, if you set the experiment up to detect which slit the photon travels through, but you do it by only placing a detector to measure one slit, the photons that travel through the slit that is not detected also act like particles. So that's weird. For the photons that travel through the undetected slit, their wave function collapses despite the detector never going off. And so there's no actual interaction with the detector, and yet apparent collapse still happens. There was a superposed possibility of interaction, but it didn't happen in actuality. In actuality, it's as if our simply knowing, by process of elimination, that a photon that hit the screen didn't go through the slit with the detector made it act like a particle the whole time. Whereas if we hadn't been monitoring, again, the slit it didn't even go through, it would have acted like a wave. That's a little weird. It doesn't seem like we touched it. But we'll brush that aside because I want to talk about the von Neumann chain. So let's go back to this idea that these waves are fragile, so if you touch them, they'll collapse. Well, the question arises, what are you touching them with? Because according to quantum mechanics, anything you touch them with is also a quantum mechanical system, because everything is. And we've already seen what happens when quantum mechanical systems touch. They act like intersecting waves. They don't collapse each other. In fact, nothing in quantum mechanics at any point says there should be a collapse. Things governed by the Schrödinger wave function, and in theory everything is, do not collapse each other, and so no contact should ever result in collapse. While a point of collapse is never specified, quantum mechanics nonetheless says that whenever the experimenter observes the results, he'll see things have collapsed according to the Born rule, which is basically just takes the waves as probabilities as to where you'll find the particle once it's collapsed, but says nothing about when it should collapse or what kind of interaction results in collapse, because the answer to that, according to the Schrödinger wave function on which those probabilities are based, is actually never. And so the measurement problem in quantum mechanics is that nobody knows when collapse happens. Everything should just be wave-like entanglement with no collapse ever, and yet as human beings, we only ever observe collapsed states. Enter John von Neumann, famous mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, you name it. He was considered by many of his early 20th century contemporaries to be the smartest man who had ever lived. Von Neumann came up with what we now call the von Neumann chain, where he said you can arbitrarily ascribe collapse to any point along the chain from the photon emission to it hitting the first electron on the sensor, to the signal traveling up the electrons of a wire to the computer, to the workings of the computer, to the monitor screen, to the photons traveling from the screen to our eyes, to our retinas, to our brains, to our conscious observation. But everything up to our conscious observation in quantum mechanics is a physical system, and therefore an ultimately quantum system that should not predicate collapse. Therefore, he concluded that collapse happens only at the conscious mind. Here's PBS spacetime if you don't believe me.
The von Neumann chain from detector to mind is a chain of quantum objects. With no clear boundary between the quantum and the classical, where does the collapse of the wave function happen? We call this open question the measurement problem. John von Neumann believed that the wave function collapse must happen at the moment of conscious awareness of the result of an experiment.
And by the way, that's how the formalism of quantum mechanics is designed. Quantum mechanics can't get rid of the observer because collapse states are what the observer sees, not what otherwise happens in quantum mechanics. And we simply cannot use the rules of quantum systems obeying the Schrödinger wave function, which is supposed to be all of physicality when we're not looking, to define an observer. Now, you might be thinking maybe von Neumann was a smart guy, but since then, surely things have gone in the direction of clearing up this silly observer-dependent formalism in favor of something like classical physics. No, absolutely not. Things, if anything, have gone the other way. Since then, we've had the results of the Bell experiments, which obliterated local realism, and the results of Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, which took the already fascinating fact that observers selecting an experimental setup could arbitrarily determine whether the results of experiment were consistent with either of two contrary modes of propagation, and showed that the decision could be made even after a photon passed through the very double slit it was believed, based on the evidence, to have taken one of the forms to traverse, seemingly implying that even this was undecided until or retroactively determined at the point of the experimenter's ex post facto choice of setup.
The quantum can go both routes, or it can go a single route. And it's possible to choose which, after the particle has already made its travel.
Wheeler, a true giant of 20th century physics, thought that our seemingly profoundly observer-tuned universe hinged on what he called observer participancy. Dishearteningly, much of the rest of the field has resigned itself to what's called the shut up and calculate method, where they basically ignore the problem.
Those who don't have any interest in, say, pursuing the measurement problem, which is basically shut up and calculate.
Einstein, shut up and calculate.
By ignoring the problem, they let stand the sort of Newtonian clockwork paradigm they likely prefer, which as a result remains dominant in academia despite being thoroughly debunked. As an aside, the outrageous thing is that Newton himself did not believe the universe reduced to Newtonian clockwork. Newton was fully aware that classically deterministic physics was not self-explanatory and insisted that the order of his system substantiated a preeminent consciousness or God, claiming, quote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." Just like once someone invents the car, any knuckle dragger can drive it, many men who by almost any standard were less accomplished than Newton and ironically far less respectful of the giant shoulders they stood on have continued to try to use the remarkable systematization he showed to argue for a universe that reduces to basic mechanism to this day, even now that it's been thoroughly debunked, on top of having never made sense in the first place. And so, if as Newton knew, physics doesn't explain itself, how do we get a fundamental explanation of reality? Enter the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, or CTMU.
Which brings us to you should probably explain it, but the
CTMU, Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. An identity is something that distributes over everything in the system, right? And the CTMU is designed to be that identity. So it is everywhere present, on both physical and metaphysical levels.
So I'm going to start with a little dash of background I find notable because it's what brought my attention to the theory in the first place, but it's non-critical, so feel free to skip the next 45 seconds or so. The CTMU was developed in total isolation from modern academia by Christopher Langan. In the 80s, he was working as a bouncer on Long Island, and having no connections or academic reputation, he had no way to publish his work. The internet wasn't even an option. The term blog didn't exist yet. At the time, Omni magazine published what was considered the world's hardest IQ test, and scoring above a certain threshold granted one access to the Mega Society, which had a journal members could publish in, which obviously brought with it whatever credibility or notoriety one might associate with membership in an IQ society with a purported 1 in a million cutoff. It's very hard to test IQ above a certain range, but this test was standardized half a dozen times and was the most reputable of its kind. Washington Post literally ran an entire article on White House Chief of Staff John Sununu's impressive result on the test, listing some of the brutal questions, affirming its selectiveness, and mentioning that MIT PhD Sununu's score had been narrowly beaten by the guy who literally wrote the book on how to unscramble the Rubik's Cube. The peer-reviewed journal Psych would eventually publish a paper to the effect that the mega test did, quote, likely stretch to the 1 in a million level. Langan ended up getting the high score on this test, which not only gave him access to publishing in the journal, Noesis, but also gave him some press as the smartest man in America, if not the world. He was famously brought on ABC's 2020, and a Yale neuropsychologist gave him a battery of tests and concluded his IQ was off the charts, too high to be measured.
His score reported as too high to measure.
The highest individual that I have ever measured in 25 years of doing this.
But while that kind of stuff did succeed in bringing people's attention to his theory, of which I'm a personal testament, there hasn't really been anything of a basic primer written on it. And so this is an attempt to do something along those lines. Not unlike Newton, Langan recognized that empirical methodology was fundamentally insufficient to answer the big questions, and so he turned instead to mathematics, specifically mathematical logic, which includes model theory, theory of computation, etc. Langan deduced logico-mathematical principles that would by definition have to be true for any internally intelligible system of reality, like the one in which we exist. If you read his papers, there are a bunch of these principles, but they have considerable overlap, and so we're going to make do primarily with the mathematical property of closure and the notion of a global syntax. So Langan defines the system of reality to have the property of closure in what he calls the reality principle. In his 2002 paper, The Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, A New Kind of Reality Theory, he states, quote, reality, i.e. the real universe, contains all and only that which is real. The reality concept is analytically self-contained. If there were something outside reality that were real enough to affect or influence reality, it would be inside reality, and this contradiction invalidates any supposition of external reality. In his 2018 paper, The Metaformal System, he writes, if there were anything outside reality on which reality were in any way dependent, e.g. for origination, causation, support, maintenance, or anything else, then the entire dependency relationship would be real and therefore inside reality. The immediate implication of this is very interesting. As Langan states in that 2002 paper, quote, given an object, event, set, or process, it is usually assumed to have come about in one or both of just two ways. One, its existence owes to something prior and external to it. Two, it is uncaused and sprang forth spontaneously and pointlessly in something from nothing, rabbit out of a hat sort of way, as if by magic. At first glance, there seems to be no middle ground, but there is another possibility after all, self-determinacy. Self-determinacy is the type of causal attribution suitable for a perfectly self-contained system. Okay, so far so good. A couple side notes. Sometimes people try to get away from the need for an explanation by saying something just is, or equivalently that it's just random, but random determinacy amounts to fundamentally indeterminate determinacy and is therefore logically contradictory on its face. Existence is self-evidently existentially viable, and declaring it random or causeless, or equivalently declaring that it just exists, denies it the very existential viability inarguably implied by its existence. As Langan stated in his 2002 paper, randomness is synonymous with indeterminacy or acausality, and when all is said and done, acausality means just what it always has, magic. You also can't have a scheme in which reality is fundamentally piecemeal. If parts were self-sufficient, they'd be independent universes. And if they're not self-sufficient, they can't aggregate into something that becomes self-sufficient because that would require forming in the first place. So you really need some unitary principle or fundament that supports itself, and we're going to get into that next. Notice also that if you read Langan's 2002 definition of the reality principle, where all effects or influences are inside of reality, you might have gleaned that reality is definable on the way in which it affects or influences itself. And indeed, as it states, anything that affects reality is real, and conversely, anything that has no effect in reality obviously isn't. In other words, what reality responds to as real, and what reality doesn't respond to as real obviously would not be. Reality has to have this internal self-detection, or what in the theory of computation you'd characterize as acceptance. And this transitions us nicely to our next notion, which is that of a global accepting syntax. Reality cannot anywhere consist of anything but that which makes it real, And so some universal principle of system inclusion must create and bind it as a common system of coexistence. In mathematical logic, this can be denoted as a common syntax, which are the rules of structure and processing that define a system, or more succinctly, its overall rules of inclusion. Computationally, where reality is defined on its internal effects upon itself, this amounts to a global accepting syntax, or a common syntax of detection that is singularly fundamental. As Langen states in his 2002 paper, quote, any difference relation entails a common medium in syntax. Related entities are manifestations of one and the same ontological medium. In an even earlier paper, he states that reality's common manifold, quote, rules out pluralistic explanations of reality, forcing us to seek an explanation at once monic, because it's non-pluralistic, and holistic, because the basic conditions for existence are embodied in the manifold, which equals the whole. More colloquially, we've derived a fundamental fabric of reality that must holistically be a function of itself. As a helpful aside, before getting into how reality's self-function works, it's important to realize that despite the use of some technical and therefore mechanical-sounding language, a self-determinative reality can't simply be self-forced in a robotic sense. The term robotic basically means forced. It's etymologically derived from the Slavic word for slave. The reason this doesn't work is being forced is being subordinate to that force by definition. And if something's self-forced, this requires it being forced by the very self, which is subordinate to being forced by the very same self, which is subordinate, and so on. And the result is an infinite regress of subordinates, i.e. causal impotence, where the need for initiatory force would never be provided. Any scheme of explanatory buck passing, no matter how intricate or convoluted, is a logical non-starter by definition. Instead, as Langen was pointing out as far back as the early noesis papers, reality turns out to be of its own generalized drive, or telic, as we'll soon see. So we have this strange case where the same ultimate entity has to serve as all aspects of being its own function, or being a function of itself. And again, we're addressing the most general or fundamental function reality performs. The output is what a function produces, so it's obviously that. But it's also its own input, not just because it has nothing else to work with, but because we've defined reality on its internal detection. And so accepting or taking itself as input is critical. That's actually what it has to produce. In computational terms, this amounts to a self-accepting transducer. In model theory, it's a self-model, but we're going to keep it super simple with just the basic notion of functions you learned in middle school. You have acceptance of input, production of output, and together they're a function. So in the irreducible dynamic required for reality to make itself internally real by responding to itself as real, acceptance and production must converge such that the system's acceptance of itself is the very thing that catalyzes it to produce that very acceptance of itself. Okay? It's a positive feedback loop. In higher level math, they sometimes refer to input as source, function as mapping, and output as target. Well, in this case, what the function produces is literally targeted because its acceptance, the way in which it is taken, has to be exactly what operationalizes it to produce it in that very state of acceptance. In other words, given that it's producing itself strictly in the context of the reception that equivalently leads it to produce that very reception, it's doing it for the sake of that reception. As Langen states, reality is telic, or is its own end. It's a positive feedback loop or a positive self-reception. You might want to pause the video to mull that feedback loop over. If you're going to contract acceptance and production into one, as you have to do for reality to create itself in its response to itself as real, you have a reception that drives or excites itself, which is a positive self-reception by any rational definition, right? We're effectively back in Genesis. God saw that it was good. Now, positive here effectively amounts to shorthand for positive utility. In game theory and decision theory, utility is the name given to the criterion by which some outcomes are determined over others. As Langen states, to self-configure, the universe must have a self-actualization criterion. Now, academics often define utility through what's called a functionalist approach, which is to say that they quantitatively define utility by the behavioral determinations that are made rather than in a psychological sense. In other words, utility is a way of quantifying tendencies by defining them on their outcomes, but those who believe that humans are simply meat machines have to implicitly believe that it's just a shortcut, a way of glossing over underlying mechanisms that don't really care about outcomes, and that caring about outcomes is just an illusion that meat robots such as humans engage in order to talk about themselves because they don't have more granular access to their own physical mechanics. However, in the case of reality itself at least, the outcome of reality is convergent with its determination, because you cannot have one without the other without an explanatory gap, again, either that of indeterminate determinacy or determination outside of reality. Because the outcome of existence is itself its own cause, the outcome is not incidental, but is its own reason for being. It is its own drive or incentive. Hence, reality is not superficially, but fundamentally a utility function. It determines in favor of itself because it is fundamentally preferable for it to do so, and this being its own incentive is what intrinsically explains its self-recognizable being. Here's another way to look at it. We've already established that reality is its own ultimate determinate. A determinate is that which determines in favor of an outcome, as opposed to its absence, but obviously being a determinate doesn't necessarily imply favoring something in a willful sense like we as human beings tend to feel we do. Sufficient air pressure can determine in favor of flight, for example, with no apparent concern for the object it lifts up. But the ultimate determinate has to be a special determinate, because to truly originate, it must be a self-determinate. It's a determinate that must originatively determine in favor of itself. Where a determinate determines in favor of itself, it determines in favor of that by which it determines in favor, because that by which it determines in favor is what it is. Thus, reality's fundamental determinant must ultimately consist of a real, internally appreciable principle of self-favorability that is such as to recognize and fundamentally agree with or determinatively favor itself. The favorability is its own reason. Colloquially speaking, it resonates with itself. That's how you get a world unto itself that's internally self-explanatory. And of course, self-favorability is just an informal way of saying self-utility, utility that is indeed its own driver or end. And so we've derived this psychological or subjective aspect. Given such fundamental self-utility, our own apparent self-utility becomes far less surprising. Conversely, finding out that our universe fundamentally consists of self-utility should be of little surprise, as we know firsthand that our own apparent self-utility appears to enable its own internal world. So while quantum physics remains frustrated by the infamous measurement problem, because it doesn't seem sensible that reality only concretizes for apparently self-utile observers, it is perfectly sensible because that's the only point of existence. Indeed, in order to be internally real, or real from the inside, reality necessarily permeates itself with localized images possessing its fundamental first-person self-utility that can treat each other and the reality they mutually, albeit often competitively, concretize as an informational environment. Local free will follows from the fact that reality can't be a deterministic program in some larger, unaccounted computer conveniently preceding it and adding in the structure needed to execute it. Instead, to work, its programming must be equal to its execution, i.e., to what it carries out, meaning reality everywhere participatorily programs in the act of being. More simply, reality is irreducible because nothing less than all of reality equals reality, and every part of something that is ultimately irreducible must be contributive. Reality thus contains contents like a mind dependent on the ideas of which it consists, so even quote-unquote dumb physicality amounts to shared ideas contributing to the terrain reckoned with by localized ideas of self, e.g. human minds, who contributively participate in an ultimate idea of self or self-conception containing it all. That's the flip side of a truly holistic explanation. Sure, you need a common principle, but anything less than the principle's full expression is not the full principle. So for our universe, you need a common principle that is wildly permutable, which fortunately is no obstacle for the principle of mind. Now, a domain shared by a multitude of self-utility functions will see their various influences sort of aggregate or converge upon relatively impassive physical laws at the very general level. We share those general laws of physics. That's what puts us in the same physical universe. However, at the local level, reality has to be malleable enough for participation in it. So when you look at levels that are more and more specific, you see more flex in reality's general tendencies, which is the gradated probabilism of the quantum mechanical picture. The answer for why non-biological physical entities aren't themselves collapsers of the wave function is because even though they must be real aspects of our collective utility functions to exist, they effectively serve as game-theoretic resources. They don't themselves have a vantage point that interfaces with reality in a way that is viable for a personal utility function to operate from. To be more specific, generally a position will not be nucleated directly by any self-utility function if it is of insufficient plasticity, e.g. if it has insufficient chemical versatility in terms of things like bonding and structure, or its plasticity does not interface with its environment in a way that allows it to harvest it as a meaningful self-utility process. In the somewhat inadequate standard biological terms, it lacks a metabolic network. Biophysical parameters in any particular system of cosmos may not be fully deducible because they come from an optimization that aggregates over all involved self-utility functions, but the fact remains that what collapses the wave function, or more generally, what determines reality, are self-utility functions like you and me, and ultimately God Almighty, the meta or omni-utility function, who factors in all of our local influences. Amazingly, this all shakes out of the fact that reality must inform its own structure internal to a syntax that is entirely a function of itself, which, seeing as reality is mathematically definable as a common system under closure, is ultimately inarguable. On a theological note, just because the ultimate self-conception or idea of self, or more succinctly God, is permeated by localized ideals of self that have considerable autonomy, enough that such ideas literally take on lives of our own, does not mean he is helpless. God, who guides the willing, observes how all ideas of self play out in the context in which they were ideated, e.g. life on Earth, and naturally sorts them once said contextual life ends on the all-important basis of faithfulness to self-utility as a whole. This amounts to a meta-Darwinian process where true fitness is proving utile to God, as God rationally salvages and amplifies what is utile to his self-defined existence and relegates what is not to the logical complement space of his self-definition. This ultimate sorting function is where reports from Scripture to NDE case study literature of divine judgment, as well as heaven and hell, come from. Per Langen, quote, "We can attain a state of grace, we can draw near to God and partake of his eternal nature, we can fall from God's grace, we can lose our souls from doing evil. In all cases, we are unequivocally answerable to the system that grants and sustains our existence, and doing right by that system and its contents, including other subsystems like ourselves, is why we exist." Thank you.